Of the saint that I'm going to talk about tonight is Padre Pio, or Saint Pio of Pietrelcina is his official name. But we'll talk about him tonight. And some of you guys have heard of him, some of you haven't. I hadn't heard of him until probably about 2008 or 2009. And the thing is he died within my lifetime. I'm really old. So he died in 1968. How old am I talking? That I am? I'm old. I'm not as old as Padre Pio, but I'm old. Let's put it this way. I remember the first moon landing. I watched it live. Wow, what's that growing for? It was awesome. So anyway, Padre Pio. He was born, so he was an Italian saint. He spent most of his entire life kind of in central Italy. He was born in a little town called Pietrelcina, which is, if you guys know your geography, I've got a map here and you'll never be able to see it, but if you know your geography of Italy, Italy is shaped like a boot, and kind of up the coast a little bit, there's like a little hook on the back of the boot. And between there and on the other coast is Naples. Pietrelcina is kind of in the middle of there, right in the middle of the peninsula. And he was born there. He was one of 5 kids. But from a real early age, he already exhibited some signs that he kind of had a degree of holiness about him. His parents were very devout Catholics, raised the kids Catholic, very much so. And, they took him to church all the time. They prayed the rosary at home. They did all sorts of things like that. But he just kind of, found enjoyment in prayer and things like that. As a kid, he would have these mystical experiences. There's a couple movies about him, but I also did a lot of reading. But he could see Jesus and Mary and his guardian angel almost all the time. He could see them around him. And in fact, it surprised him once when he was talking with his friends, and he mentioned something about that because he just assumed everybody could see Jesus and Mary and their guardian angel, and they were like, "We don't know what you're talking about." And so it was kind of a unique thing that people kind of realized there was a little bit more to him. But when you get to see Jesus and Mary, you also, unfortunately, have to put up with the other side too. And so he saw a lot of demons. He was actually chased a lot by demons in the form of large dogs and things like that. He was chased a lot by that. They would torment him. And so there's you wind up with both sides of the coin there. And so, but he always would, in one of the movies, there's a scene where he's being chased by this like Rottweiler, right? It's a large dog. And he goes into church and he's asking Jesus, he's like, why is this happening to me? Why aren't you doing something about it? And then he just, in his prayer, then he just kind of had this peace, and he realized that he was always going to be protected in some fashion from these demons. But it was something that he was going to have to put up with as well. There's a story, he had a vision once where he was with his guardian angel, and the guardian angel they brought him into a large field, and in the field was this humongous demon, and he says, "You're going to have to fight this demon." And he's like, "I'm not going to be able to do it." He says, "You need to trust in the one who can help you." And so he fought this demon, and he won, and the demon ran away. But he said, "You're going to have to face him again. You're going to face him throughout your entire life." And so this was an ongoing battle that he faced. He was born, his name was actually Francesco, Francis, it's French, or the Italian version of Francis. Francesco Forgione is his name. And he didn't receive the name Pio until he became a monk. He became a friar. He went into the novitiate for that when he was 16 years old. And the reason he did that is that there was a lot more monks and brothers and nuns and things like that at that time. But there was a friar that was coming to the town asking for alms. And he spoke to this one friar, and he really liked that. He went to his mom and his dad, and he says, "I really want to be a friar because I want to have a beard like this brother had." And so they realized, they were extremely poor. And so they realized that was going to cost a lot of money if they were going to do that. And so they didn't really have any way to do it. So his father went to America to earn money so that Franchi, as everybody called him, could enter the monastery and study. So his father was willing to go overseas to earn money to help his son. And so the family had a great love amongst them. They were willing to do a lot for each other. So anyway, so he enters at age 16. He was born in the late 1880s, so this is like, so 1887 was born, so 16 is 1903. So again, just trying to place it in history for you guys. By 1910, he was done with his studies and he was ordained a priest. So when he was about 23, okay, and if you know your history, this is right on kind of right before the beginning of World War I. And so he was in not a convent, in a monastery in a town called Foggia. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that. That's kind of quite a bit east. It's the largest city kind of east of Pietrelcina, over towards the Adriatic Sea. But he was always sick there. He just seemed to, he was sickly as a child, but he was really sick there. And he had tuberculosis and all stuff, so they sent him home thinking he's not going to make it. But he became better when he was at home. The air of his native village seemed to help him. And so once he got better, they said, okay, you need to come back. And eventually, he went back and he got worse again. So they sent him home again. And basically they said, okay, for a time, we're going to let you stay at home. We're going to give you, because when you're a Franciscan friar, especially a Capuchin, you live there, you stay at the monastery. But they gave him a dispensation because they felt like he was going to die if he stayed. So we're going to let you stay at home and heal. Well, during this time, right around 1915, 1916, of course, that's in the midst of World War I. And they were drafting pretty much everybody. And so they were even drafting the friars out of the monasteries to be soldiers for the war. And so he was one of the ones that was eventually picked to go. And at his physical, they're like, they took a chest x-ray and realized that he had breathing problems. And he wound up kind of going through some of the training and things like that, but they wound up sending him home because he was just too ill. And so he kind of got out of the military service that way. But around this time, when he was in Pietrelcina still, there was lots of kind of mystical experiences kind of surrounding him. A few years earlier when he was a child, he was at Mass once, and there was this mother who brought in this crippled son that she had. And she was praying up there, and there was, they were offering this child to this for this one saint's intercession. Well, Franchi started praying really fervently to the crucifix, to Jesus, to ask him to help, and the kid was cured. And even his dad was kind of like, what did you do? he's kind of like almost like, you gotta kind of keep this on the down low. So anyway, when he was a priest then in Pietrelcina still, even then they were very protective of him because there already had been some kind of miracles. He had helped there was a plague of insects that had kind of come through, and he took them through the orchards and was praying and using incense, and suddenly all of the insects died. And he was able to kind of help the farmers save their harvest. And so they're all like, oh, you're a miracle worker and things like this. And he always insisted, it's not me. God's the one who does the miracles. I merely pray. And that was one of the things that was from the very beginning, was his humility, is he always attributed it back to God, which when you think of Jesus, that's what Jesus did too, right? When a miracle would happen, he's like, give thanks to God. Even though Jesus was God, but he was showing us how to do it, okay? And so anyway, so there came a time in 1917 where, and again, this World War I's still going on, but the people in charge of the friary, they said, you have to come back to the friary, or we're going to kick you out. And so he finally acquiesced and he went back, but he was just getting sicker and sicker. And finally they said, well, let's try moving you to this other one, which has similar kind of climate to where you're from. And he says, well, where's that? He says, it's a place called San Giovanni Rotondo. It's in the mountains east of here. And so they took him there, and as they're approaching it, he saw it up on the hill, and he said, I'll never leave this place. And I think the people with him thought, well, he's going to die. I'm going to die here. And he was saying to himself, he knew that this is where he was supposed to be. And so his health, at least his breathing health and things like that, did get better there. He still had bouts with different diseases and things like that, and we'll learn about that in a second. But he knew that that's where he was supposed to be. He came there, and when he got there was only like 7 friars. There were not many there, because some of them were off fighting the war. And it was just this little out-of-the-way place in the mountains. And he was just like, this is where I'm supposed to be. And so he kind of started, he knew his theology really well, so he was kind of working with some of the younger friars and teaching them things. But then again, some of the townspeople would occasionally come up to Mass and things like that, and they just really, they started taking a liking to him. One of the things they didn't like about him so much is his Masses would go really long, because he would get caught in these ecstasies, and there were sometimes his daily Masses would be like 2 hours long. But there were some people that enjoyed that, and they really saw that he was very very holy, and so they kind of started attending more and more of those Masses. Well, in 1918, it was September 20th, 1918, and the date's important, and you'll learn why in a little bit. September 20th, 1918, he was praying in the choir loft to Jesus, saying, I want to offer myself as a victim soul. I want to help save souls. I want to take on additional penances. And after a time, he suddenly felt this pain in his hands and his feet and his side, and they started bleeding, and he received what's called a stigmata. Some of you guys know what that is, some of you don't. But basically he received puncture wounds that went all the way through his hands, all the way through his feet, and a large wound in his side, which mimicked the 5 wounds of Jesus. And he had actually received those once a long time ago for a short time, but he didn't want the visible sign because he knew it would attract attention to himself. So he asked if he could receive them but have them be invisible. And they faded away. But at this time they came back and they were visible. And his thing was he didn't want the attention drawn to himself. And he also felt the shame of those wounds, because dying on a cross in those days was a very shameful death. So he felt the shame that Jesus felt as well in dying on the cross, the human shame in that. And so, but he did not want people to, because when you receive the stigmata, he was like, people were going to be flocking to him, and he knew he was going to become the focus, and he didn't want that. He always wanted the focus to go back to Jesus, because he kept saying, I just want to be a friar who prays. But yet he had this very visible sign, and so lots more people started coming to the monastery, and so there's lots of people for the Masses, and he was they learned pretty quickly that he was a very a powerful penitent. When he had people in line for confession, the lines started growing longer and longer, because what they realized is that he would help them grow in sanctity, because he would help them have a good confession. And the way that he did that is he had the gift of being able to read souls. And so if someone came into the confessional and they, so when you go to a confessional and you maybe jot your sins down, you go in there, you try and remember them, you say, okay, these are my sins, and he would go, well, here's some other ones. And he would list off things that he knew that they had done. And they were like, they knew that they had to cleanse themselves of that. And some people he would do that to. There were some people that he knew that they were trying to withhold their sins. And so occasionally he would chase them out of the confessional. And he would do that not because he was angry at them, but he knew that because he could read souls, certain souls needed him to be really gentle and really tender just to read them. He knew other ones needed, they needed to come to the contrition on their own. And so he would, there was a couple people, he's like, get out of my confessional and things like that. And they would, and then they would come back later and he would be like, he would then give them absolution, because he knew they had actually gone away and repented. And so you never knew what was going to happen in these lines. And it got to be to the point where you had to start taking a number. And sometimes the number said you had to come back in 3 days, because he would hear confessions like 18 hours a day is what he did. He would do Mass, he would have some prayer time, and then he would be in the confessional for 18 hours a day. He only slept 2 hours a night. Okay, and keep in mind, he's got wounds that are bleeding in his hands and his feet and his side, and he's losing about a cup of blood every day. Okay, and you've only got 5-6 pints of blood. Okay, but he never seemed to, the wounds stayed the same. Occasionally they would bleed a little bit more, like during Mass, they would bleed more. During Holy Week, during the Triduum, he would have more pain and things like that, because he was experiencing parts of Christ's sufferings as well. But there almost became this following around him, and he didn't want that, right? I mean, he knew that this is what he had to deal with, and again, it was always a test of his humility. But when that happens, there are also other people who, for whatever reason, decide that this is a bad thing. And some of these people were some of the parishioners that were there. Some of these people are people in the church. And so there were people that were sending anonymous letters, and they were saying that he was letting women into the convent at night, or that he had a mistress. And one woman was there, and she was telling his the leader of the friary that they had 2 children together, and all this kind of nonsense. And they did all these tests. They found out that these were all lies, but it really took its toll. And so Padre Pio, he would simply pray harder for those people. Okay, pray for those who persecute you, right? And that's what he would do. Well, then it got, this whole thing about the stigmata, and there was even people in the church, like I said, there was cardinals, and they were petitioning the Pope, saying, you got to stop this. This is not real. You're taking us back to the Dark Ages, and he's using chemicals to create burns on his hands, so it looks like this. It's all, he's doing this to get attention and stuff like that, which was the opposite of what was happening. So they sent doctors there to check, and the first doctors came back and said, no, this is real. I mean, you meet this guy, he's not putting this on. This is not made up. And he's very humble and things like that. Well, they sent more doctors, and what they did is they said, okay, we're going to prove that he's got to be doing something, because what we're going to do is we're going to bandage his hands for 8 days, and we need to change the dressings every day, but we're going to bandage them in such a way that we'll know if anybody took the bandages off. And then we'll have a group of people there each day to change it, so we'll know if there's any changes. Well, after 8 days, the wounds looked exactly like they had before. There was no change in the wounds. And so they're like, well, he couldn't be doing anything, but yet their report back to Rome was that he was still a fraud, and that he was making people hallucinate, and that he was just like this crazy person that could somehow make himself bleed. This is what they're telling the Pope. Okay? And the Pope's kind of like, all right, well, I'll have to take your word for it. And so the Pope in 1924, Pope Pius XI, he took away Padre Pio's rights to say Mass in public. He took away his rights to hear confessions. So if he has to say Mass as a priest every day, so he had to say Masses in private in one of the private chapels. But he couldn't hear confessions, and I know if that would happen to me, I would have been like, what a jerk, and I would have been like badmouth of a Padre Pio. He didn't do that. He's like, okay, this is just what I need to accept. In fact, when people would come and say, yeah, such and such a bishop told the Pope this, that bishop's a jerk, Padre Pio slapped the guy. He said, don't you ever talk about a bishop of the church like that. Even though he knew the bishop was wrong, he said, you need to respect the people in authority, which is really interesting. There's even some people that say that Pope Pius XI at one point had a vision of Padre Pio in his chambers asking him not to do it. I haven't been able to find too much to corroborate that, but that's one of the stories that circulates this. So anyway, so he did this for several years, and he wasn't able to hear confessions, and he knew that this is what he was supposed to be doing. He was supposed to be saving souls, and he couldn't do that. And so this really wore on him a lot. Well, there came a time where they did give him back some of his powers to do things. He could at least say Mass in public. But this is in the 20s. By 1933, something like that, the Pope kind of realized that he was being told things that weren't true. And he even apologized. He says, I've been misinformed. And so he wound up over the next year giving Padre Pio all of his faculties back, and said that, that this was a travesty and should never have happened, and go ahead, Padre Pio, do what you're meant to do. And even by the time, then in 1939, Pope Pius XII came in, and Pope Pius XII is like, no, people, you should go visit this Padre Pio if you can. And especially, keep in mind, what's 1939? Beginning of World War II. Okay, and so, at that point, Italy is one of the Axis powers, right? And so they're, you're almost kind of, little enclaves of people that are still able to hold on to the faith. But the fascists under Mussolini were persecuting people in the church and things like that. So it was really a hard time. But during this time, a lot of these mystical experiences were really taken off, and some of the gifts that Padre Pio had were really starting to come into, be known. So, for instance, there was, and I think it was either right after World War II or during the war, maybe after Italy had been liberated, this soldier shows up at the church, and he said, you're the priest that saved me, you're the friar that saved me. And Padre Pio says, yes, I'm thank you for listening to me when you did. So what happened is the soldiers on the battlefield, and all of a sudden he sees this friar in amongst us. Please come over here right away. Come over to where I am right now. And he does, and as soon as he comes over here, a grenade goes off exactly where he was standing. And he turned around to thank him, and he was gone. And he was talking to the people in his platoon, and there was 2 or 3 other guys that had the same thing happen. That Padre Pio somehow, nowhere near where he was, miraculously appeared in a battle and saved these guys. And then they came to the friary and saw him, and he knew that he had saved them, even though he was in the friary the whole time. So he had this gift of bilocation. Okay, and so he could do these really amazing things. There's another story in World War II where, the Americans had helped liberate Italy. And so they had gotten word that there was a munitions dump near San Giovanni Rotondo. And so they were sent to bomb it. Okay, so they're coming over with the bombers, and all of a sudden they see this friar in the sky telling them don't do it. And when they would try to do it, they were going to, the bombs would drop somewhere else. Or they would fly out over the ocean and the bombs would drop out there. They couldn't drop the bombs on San Giovanni Rotondo. And so finally, I think he was a general, or he was like a higher up. He says, I'm going to go on this mission because we can't seem to knock this place down. I'm going to go do it myself. And he flew over and he saw Padre Pio and couldn't drop the bombs and came back and I remember saying anything like this. Well, after the war, he goes to, or maybe after this mission, he goes there and he sees Padre Pio. And Padre Pio walks up to him and goes, oh, so you're the guy that wants to bomb my friary. So he appeared in the clouds in front of the planes, to try and stop the bombing missions. So just this weird stuff like that. So not only could he bilocate, he could bilocate on the ground, in the air, and all these other places. And so he just had these miraculous gifts, but he was like, again, he never became prideful of it. I mean, if I had gotten some really cool things that I could do, I'd probably be out there boasting about it. But he didn't want the attention from it. And he didn't go out and tell people about this until they came to him. Okay. So there was things like that happening. There was also reports that he could levitate. When he was in Mass, he would get into ecstasy sometimes and he would just kind of float up. Like I said, he could read souls. He had the stigmata. I mean, think of any gift that any saint has, and he probably had it. Okay, he just kind of had the complete package. But he always was super humble about it. He was like, God gave me these gifts. I don't even understand it, right? But God has given me this, and so I will let him use it through me. There was a time in 46. It was shortly after the war, and a young priest came and visited. He had heard about Padre Pio, and he had been studying in Rome to finish up his, to be ordained. And he showed up at the convent, and Padre Pio kind of saw this priest and said, "Who's that?" He says, "Well, this priest, and he's from Poland, and he has come here because he's heard about you." And he went over to him, and Padre Pio just kind of stopped, and he knew something, and he just kind of didn't say anything to him, but he developed a friendship with him. A year or two later, and he told the friars that he said, at some point in time, that priest will elevate to the highest office in the church. A couple of years later, that priest, when he was back in Poland, wrote a letter to Padre Pio because he knew Padre Pio had this gift of intercessory prayer, and he said, "Pray for my friend, who I've known since I was a child, and she was in a concentration camp during World War II, and she has 4 children, and now she's got terminal cancer, and she's going to leave her family if she dies, so please help." And he read this letter from this Karol Wojtyła, who became Pope John Paul II, and he said, "We can't refuse this." And so a couple of days later, a letter comes in and says the mother was miraculously cured of a cancer that there was no cure for at all, and so she survived. But John Paul II kind of didn't talk much about that either, but he was also, John Paul II was the one who beatified and canonized Padre Pio. So they had a friendship that kind of traversed time there. So Padre Pio, he just, there was another time when it was in 1959, and he got what's called pleurisy, and so he had like fluid in his lungs, and they thought he was going to die and things like that. And so they basically said, okay, we're going to prepare you for last sacraments. And at the time, the statue of Our Lady of Fatima was touring, and some people made arrangements that the statue could come to St. Giovanni Rotondo. In fact, they flew it in a helicopter. And there's a story that he was looking out the window and he was talking to the Madonna. He was talking to her as the helicopter was circling the friary. And he said it circled 3 times, and he asked the Madonna to help him as she would, and he was miraculously cured of the pleurisy. And so, like I said, there's just, it must have meant that he didn't want to keep on living necessarily, but he wanted God's will to be done. And so maybe it's because people needed to see the miracles worked in him too, or worked for him, not just through him. Anyway, so he continued to age. Again, by this time, Pope Paul VI came in, and Pope Paul VI was like, he lifted all the restrictions. He actually apologized for all the things that happened to Padre Pio through the thing, because they had done investigations, and they said everything, all the accusations against Padre Pio were all false, and so you shouldn't believe any of them. In fact, you have him pray for you, basically. But then, he had been frail all his life. He had been bleeding for 50 years at this point, right? He had had the stigmata since 1918. And on September 20th, 1968, the stigmata all of a sudden started healing over. And he then told people, because some people say, well, maybe he was just faking it. He said, no, I was told at the beginning I would have the stigmata for 50 years. And then they would disappear near the end of my life. And so what some people say is as the last scab of the stigmata fell off his hands is when he died on September 23rd, 1968. Whether that's true or not, that the last scab fell off and he died, we don't know. But there was no signs of any scars. And again, he had holes in his hands. He was losing a cup of blood every day, holes in his feet, hole in his side, and all the pain that goes with that. And after 50 years, it just stopped. Okay, so he just led this incredible life. I mean, I don't think I'd want that life. I think it would be too hard, right, to have all that pain and to be able to have those gifts. I know I couldn't be humble like him. It was very difficult for him, but he just continually said, I just want to be a friar who prays. And these gifts that I've been given, I'll let God do with them what he wants. And so that's the example that I think that it leaves with us. There was another really cool miracle that happened at one point in time that's worth mentioning that I forgot to mention earlier, is that there was a little 7-year-old girl that I think they were down in Naples is where they lived, and she was born blind, but she was born, there was no pupils in her eyes. And so her mother, I think she wrote a letter to Padre Pio, but then she said, we're going to go up there too. And so Padre Pio had gotten the letter, had read it, and he was praying for her. Well, on the way up there, suddenly the girl starts to be able to see things. She's talking about a ship out in the sea, and she's talking about something on the train and things like that. And so, so they go up there, and the grandmother who's taken the girl is asking Padre Pio, please give her sight back. And Padre Pio says, are you not acknowledging that she can already see? And they checked her out. She still had no pupils in her eyes, but she was able to fully see. And the doctors checked her out. They said, this is physically impossible. You need to have pupils in your eyes in order to be able to see. And there's pictures of the girl, with just totally black eyes, and she shouldn't be able to see, but she can see. I mean, it's totally unexplainable by science. So there's just all these really odd things. Again, not that Padre Pio did anything other than let God work through him. His prayer life was so deep that and obviously he'd been given these gifts before he was even aware of them, right? He could see Jesus, he could see Mary, he could see his guardian angel, but he let God work through him. And so whether you've got these extraordinary gifts like him, or whether you're like me and you have no extraordinary gifts, we still all should be able to let God work through us in the ways that we have to surrender to that and let God do what he needs to do through us. Any questions? Claire?
I heard once that he also had the wound of on his shoulder where Jesus would have had the cross, and he never told anyone about it except
Right.
one friar or something.
Yep. And he actually said that was his most painful wound.
Right, 'cause like every time he would move, it would.
Right. Yeah. I don't know that one was visible. That might have been just the pain. I can't remember now, but I do remember reading that too. Cool. Thanks for bringing that up, Elizabeth.
How old was he when he died?
He would have been 81. So he was born in 1887 and he died in 1968. I think he was born May 25th and died on September 23rd. So his feast day just happened. And it's weird because my wife and my daughter had a devotion to Padre Pio before we started, before my wife and I started dating. And they kept seeing the number 23 everywhere. And that's the date of his thing. So they started praying to Padre Pio, and then they started seeing the number 23 everywhere. Like they'd go to Culver's and they were number 23. You know, they would get something, or they'd be doing something and 23 would show up somewhere. You know, or it would be on Highway 23 or whatever it happened to be. It was just really kind of weird. So who knows how that it works. So